my mother's background, she was from a large family in County Monaghan. They were farmers, and her name was McCluskey. Her father was Peter McCluskey, and I can't remember what my grandmother's name was, although I remember her well. She was living, I remembered her. I didn't, Peter McCluskey was dead, but they had, how many children? Let me see, can I count them? One, two, three, four, five. They had 6, 7. They had at least 7 children, and one of them went to Bournemouth in England, and she joined the Sisters of Mercy. And afterwards, her first cousin, my mother's first cousin, also went there and joined the Sisters of Mercy. In later years, when I was a priest, I went to visit them when they're both living there. Both were cooks for the Sisters of Mercy. So naturally, I was very well treated when I was there on my holiday. Next time I went to see them, my aunt had died, but my aunt's first cousin, she was still there. Sister Frances, I think, was her name, and she was still a cook, and I was still well received. But anyway, they were a large family, and my mother was telling me that they're living on a farm, and they, of course, the parents weren't able to provide for all of them, so my mother was sent to live with the local school teacher who was married to a relation of hers. So I forget the exact relationship. She was married to a relation of hers. So that was an advantage for my mother to be living in the school teacher's house, because she got a schooling, a really good schooling, which her other siblings did not have. And then when she finished school, she was kept on by the school teacher to teach the lower classes. My mother then left to become a nurse. So she went to Belfast and to the, what do you call it, there was a workhouse there, the Workhouse Union Hospital. So she did her training there in the hospital, got a good formal training, and was qualified as a state registered nurse. So she went back to Monaghan and to the principal town or city in Monaghan, and that was called Monaghan, and there was a hospital there. So she became a nurse there. She liked the nursing well, and they had a chaplain, a priest, very good priest, and he took a great interest in his nurses, and nobody ever dared criticize his nurses in his presence. He afterwards became a bishop of somewhere, Kilmacduagh or somewhere. But anyway, my mother then decided she wanted to change, and she saw an advertisement. She saw an advertisement for a vacancy, nursing vacancy in Neury, in the Neury Workhouse Hospital. So she applied. And the day she was to go for the interview, the distance would have been about, say, about 40 miles, I suppose, 40 to 50 miles. So she was having her breakfast, and before leaving, there was another nurse there, and she said, "McCluskey, give me a cup. I want to read your fortune." I should explain that in Ireland, we just put the tea leaves by a spoonful into the cup. So when we finished with all the tea leaves there at the bottom of the cup. And there were certain people who used, read a person's fortune in the tea leaves, which where the tea leaves were situated at the bottom of the cup. Some people took it seriously. Most people thought it was a joke. So she said, "McCluskey, give me your cup." My mother didn't pay any attention, but she took the cup and she was concentrating very much on the tea leaves in the bottom of the cup. And she said, "You're going to meet a man, strange man, he's a tall man, and something wrong with him. He seems to be a cripple. He's not able to walk correctly. And you're going to marry him." So all the nurses laughed, and my mother off she went for the interview. So she arrived, and the other candidates for interview were sitting there, and she joined them on a bench, sitting outside the boardroom door. Boardroom door was there. They were sitting here, and next to the boardroom door was another door into the master's office, my father's office. So she saw a man coming up the stairs, and she thought she was looking, and she said, "Something wrong with him." She noticed that he'd put his right leg forward, and then pull up the left leg, right leg, pull up the left leg, and she realized that his left leg was stiff. And when he went into his office and closed the door, he said to the others who were beside her, who were locals, "Who is that man?" Oh, they said, "That's Mr. Greenham. He's the master of the workhouse." So she said, "That's the man I'm going to marry." Everybody burst out laughing. So then she went in for her interview, and she got the job. Now, it so happened that my mother was the only trained nurse on the entire staff. That often happened in those days. Now, the matron of the hospital was a religious sister, one of the St. John of God sisters from Wexford. And the assistant matron was also a St. John of God sister, and there was one or two more John of God sisters, and they were there, they were staffing the hospital, and there was Nurse Bennett. She wasn't trained, but she was a very good nurse from long experience, and perhaps another nurse. So my mother arrives, and she discovers that she is the only trained nurse in the entire place. Even the matron wasn't trained. So she was inclined to be rather critical. My mother could be critical, and my mother would express her views. The sister in charge didn't like it, and they put her on night duty, and then would keep her. The normal length of night duty was 1 month, but she would be put on night duty for 6 months. And then she did not like the way that she was being treated, and she thought of their chaplain back in Monaghan. He had now become a bishop, and she got his address, and she wrote to him, and she said to him, "Remember me, I'm one of your nurses." And she told him how she was being treated, discriminated against. So he was very much annoyed, one of his nurses. And he wrote to the local bishop. Both of them were from the same diocese originally. He wrote to the local bishop, Bishop Mulhern, and told Bishop Mulhern to look into the matter. So Mulhern came for his walk one day up to the hospital, and the sisters were all flapping all of a doodah around the bishop, "Oh, Bishop, my lord," and all this. And then they invited him up to the convent for a cup of tea. He went up, and they were there. He said, "I'd like to speak to Nurse McCluskey." Surprise. And I said, oh, Bishop, my Lord, unfortunately you cannot see her. She is asleep. You see, she's on night duty, and she can't be disturbed now because she'll be waking up about 6 or 7 in the evening to have a meal and then to go on night duty. He said, how long has she been on night duty? So they said, whatever it was, 5 or 6 months. He said, do all nurses be on night duty for that length of time? Or is she the only one? So then they were surprised. They had to admit that she was the only one. Well, now he said, when Nurse McCluskey comes off duty tonight, she will not go on night duty again for another 6 months. And thereafter she'll go on night duty only once, taking her turn with the others. And now he said goodbye. He walked out. Well, they were surprised. So when my mother came up and had her meal, was about to go on night duty, the matron came to her. She says to her, do you know Bishop O'Hearn? No, she said. Who is he? Well, he's the bishop of this diocese. You never met him? No, I never met him. Don't know him. And you haven't been in contact with him? No, I don't know the man at all. I don't know who you're talking about. So they couldn't make out what had happened. But they were very, very careful with regard to her in future. Now, any chance, one time she came on duty, she was on the children's ward, babies. Now the rule was that before the day nurse went off duty, she had to ensure that all the children had been changed, the sheets had been changed, everything was ready for night duty, for the night. But when my mother came on duty, she would find that the children had not been changed. Every bed was soiled, so she had to go and change them all, and change the sheets and everything, which should have been done by the day nurse. So there was a book there, Nurse's Report. So when she'd done this, she wrote up a full-page report about the condition in which she found the ward when she came on duty. Full-page description. And then the next day when the doctor came on duty, he would check this and look at this. What's the meaning of this? Why wasn't this done? So thereafter, my mother, when she'd go on night duty, when she'd be on night duty, she'd do her work, she'd open this book and just bend it back that way, completely back to front, so that this page was open. And then she would sit on the book during the night when she had nothing else to do. And she'd do that night after night, so that when the book was opened, it always opened at that page. So this was always the page the doctor saw, the same page. And eventually they got mad and somebody tore out the page. Now, as you can imagine, they soon found reasons to complain about her and to report her to the Board of Guardians. But to do so, they had to make the report to the master, my father, and then he had to appear before the board and present the complaint against whoever, against whomsoever. So he had to present the claim, this protest, whatever it was, complaint against Nurse McCluskey, and she got a warning from the board. And then after some time, there was another complaint, a more serious complaint, and once again he had to, she was there, he had to present the complaint, and then she was given a second warning. The third time it happened, she was given a third warning, final warning, threaten with dismissal if there were any more complaints. So my father went back to his office and he said to himself, this is strange. It's always this nurse, McCluskey, that the complaints are against. There's never any complaints against any other nurse. Why is that? So he began to wonder. But the day after the final complaint, my father used to go to 7 o'clock Mass in St. Catherine's, Dominican Church. And my mother, coming off night duty, would go to the 8 o'clock Mass before going to bed. So on this first morning, after the final complaint, my father was coming home and he saw Nurse McCluskey coming towards him. I should ask about mother. I should mention my mother had a little squint, I think, in her, I don't know which eye it is, you'll see it up there in that photograph. She had a little squint, I think, in her right eye, was it? Is it? Was it right eye?
My glasses. I think it's her left.
The which?
It looks like it's her left.
Left. Well, anyway, that's just one thing I remembered about it. But when she came to, she met my father, came passing, she said to him, "Good morning, Mr. Greenan." And he said, "Oh, good morning, Nurse McCluskey." And he went off, he smiled to himself. So the next morning, the same thing happened. "Good morning, Mr. Greenan." "Good morning, Nurse McCluskey." So he said, Now he said, tomorrow, next day, he changed over to the opposite side of the street, Needham Street. He changed over to the opposite side, so he would be walking around, but she would come around the corner on this side, so we won't be on the same side. She came around the corner, saw he was on the opposite side, so she immediately changed over to the opposite side. I said, And she came up to him, she said, "Good morning, Mr. Greenan." And he said, "Good morning, Nurse McCluskey." Now, when he was telling me this at home, my mother was in the kitchen, she was preparing the dinner. And and then he said to me, "Well, what could I do but marry her?" And it was just at that moment as she walked into the room with the dinner. And she said, "There's not a word of truth in it, not a word of truth in it." Then I knew it was true. I knew it was true. But anyway, that's how they met. Very interesting story, isn't it? And then the story develops. I was born 1917, 11th of January, and the World War was still going on, wouldn't finish until November the following year. Now, the Black and Tans were in Neury, and these British officers were there with them. And there was a hotel called the Victoria Hotel, and the man who was the clerk of the union, the clerk was my father's boss. There was the master and then the clerk. The clerk was the boss, W.R. Bell. And he used to go down after his work, go down to the Victoria Hotel, have a meal and have a drink, and he would meet there with British officers, these Black and Tan officers. He was very much against my father. My father was a Catholic, and he thought that a Catholic should not have the job. And he wanted to get rid of my father, but he had no grounds on which to get rid of him, except to have him killed. So, while Bell, W.R., was drinking with the British officers, they were discussing, planning how he could be shot by the Black and Tans. And they discovered, you see, that Bell told them he comes back, he comes like he's out doing something at night time. Actually, he was teaching Irish up in the hills somewhere, in the countryside. He was teaching Irish to a class there. and when he'd arrive back it would be about 11 o'clock. So it said he arrives back about 11 o'clock. So if you have some of the black and tans there, but 11 o'clock, they can shoot him and nobody will know.
I think you should say something about the black and tans. Who are they?
Oh, I speak about the black and tans. After World War I, when the troops were demobbed, England didn't know what to do with all these troops. They were now fighting with the Irish in the Civil War in Ireland. So many of these troops got a job. They were paid to go over to Ireland and to carry on this war to suppress the Irish rebellion. And the officers would go over, they were well paid. And then also people who were in jail for various crimes, they were freed from jail on condition that they would join the black and tans, or we call the tans, and go over and fight against the Irish. That's also what the British did. So these black and tans, the officers were real officers in the British Army, but the others were all kinds of people, you know, ragtag and bobtail. So they had planned that night to shoot my father. Now there was a policeman standing at the bar drinking. His name was John Reid. John Reid was a Protestant. He was a Protestant and he was Presbyterian, and he was one of the Orange Men. These were people who were very, very anti-Catholic, bitterly anti-Catholic. But John Reid was a good man. He was a police officer, and he heard all this plotting to kill my father. So even though he may have been an Orange Man, he may have been a Protestant, but his attitude was, I'm an Irishman. So he went up in his uniform to my mother, and my mother, when she saw the uniform, Orange Man, everything, she was afraid. She was not from the north, she was from Monaghan, the south, you see, so she was afraid, and I was just born, I was a baby, and he said to her, where is your husband? And she said, I don't know. Oh, he said, I can understand you. He said, Mrs. Green, I'm a policeman, I'm RIC, I'm an Orange Man, I'm a Freemason, he said, and you don't trust me. I can understand all that. But this is a very serious matter. He said, I've just come from the Victoria Hotel, and Mr. Bell, he said, the clerk, he's there drinking down there with some of the English officers, and they're plotting to kill your husband. They're going to send a couple of these black and tan soldiers to wait for him at 11 o'clock. They say he comes home at 11. So if you don't tell me where he is, your husband is going to be killed. You have got to trust me, or your husband will be killed. Well, she all right. I trust you. And he's up in the hill, and she described the exact place, described the house, indicated the house where he was teaching Irish. She said, you'll find him there. Now he said, you go to bed with the baby, go to bed with the child, he said, and don't be worried, have a good sleep. And your husband will not come back tonight. I'll see to that. But he'll come back in the morning. So he went up and he knocked on the door, and they were all startled when they saw a policeman. He said, is Mr. Greenan here? And there was silence. My father came forward and he said, yes. He said, I am Mr. Greenan, he said. He said, I want to talk to you, he said, come outside. So he came outside, he told my father exactly what had happened. He said, I've been to your wife and told her. So I told her not to worry, to sleep, go to bed, but that you're not coming home tonight. You must not go home tonight because they're going to shoot you. And they're waiting for you at 11 o'clock. So he said, I'll fix things up with the banatee. Banatee in Irish means the woman of the house. So he goes in and says, where's the banatee? So she came forward, this man, Mr. Greenan, he's sleeping here tonight. But I've no bedroom, that doesn't matter, this is the kitchen, there's the floor. He said, get a mattress, he said, and put the mattress on the floor, and get some blankets and covering, and he can sleep here beside the fire. So my father slept there, had a good sleep, sound sleep, and he woke up in the morning, and he went down about 9 o'clock, and entered, there was nobody there, went up home and had breakfast with my mother. So then they reported back to headquarters that he didn't come home. Then they knew there was an informer, but they couldn't find out who that informer was. They never suspected a policeman who'd been standing at the bar. So since my father had been informed, and my father knew, as they did it then afterwards, the whole news would get out and who planned it, who shot him. So they never again tried it. But then Bell was always trying to get rid of my father. We jumped forward some years, and I would be by this time a young boy of about, I would say, 7, I would think, or perhaps 8, 7 or 8. And I was going around the front, you see, and there was a car was waiting. Bell had called upon the government to send down an inspector. Major Thrush was his name. He'd been in the army, he'd been demobbed, he was a major, but he was sent down by the government for an inspection, and the inspection was to carry out an inspection on Mr. Greenan and how he was running his part of the work. So therefore the inspector would submit a negative report in order to get my father removed. As I walked around, Bell and Thrush, Major Thrush, I heard my father saying there was Major Thrush coming for, Inspector Thrush they called him, yes. But I was 7, that's all I knew. But Bell, there was a taxi, they called a taxi, a Hackney car, a Ford 2 it was in those days, a Ford 2, the old model. And they called me, and they got me, a small boy, into the back seat between them. And Mr. Bell said, you know me, he said, I'm Mr. Bell, and this is Major Thrush. He's come down here on inspection. I suppose you heard your father speaking about it. So I said, quite innocently, no. And he said, come, he said, what's your name? I said, Lawrence. Oh, he said, come, he said, Lawrence. Your father's a great friend of mine, we're both great friends. He said, I'm quite sure you must often have heard your father and mother speaking about me. And I, with a complete bland, innocent smile, say, no, I said, I never heard them speaking about you. So they kept on, the car was going, we passed the Dominican church, and no, I was, completely simple face, completely simple. Never heard them speaking about you. So the saw was going to get nowhere. So they stopped the car outside a sweet shop, and they gave me half a crown, which was, of course, regarded as big money in those days. Half a crown, and I went into the shop, and of course I bought all kinds of sweets, you see, bought this and this and this and this and this. I was so proud, and I walked home with my arms full of sweets. And my father said to me, where did you get the sweets? And I was only a youngster, but I was cunning. I was cunning, and I was going to play this for all it was worth. Oh, I said, I went around there at the front, and I met Mr. Bell and Inspector Thrush, and they were in the car, and they invited me into the car, and they were asking me, about you, Daddy, and they said, Mr. Bell said that he was a great friend of yours. My mother got very suspicious, you see, very suspicious, very frightened, and they asked me he asked me, I suppose you often heard your father and mother speaking about me. And my mother shouted, what did you say, what did you say? He said, Mommy, he said, let the child speak for himself. So he said, and what did you say? Oh, I said, no, I never heard them speaking about you. He said, surely you must have heard them speaking about me. He and I were great friends, so I'm the clerk and he's the master, and you must often have heard your mother and father speaking of it. And I did the innocent face to say my father was watching me. I said, no, I never heard them speaking about you. Never heard them mention your name. And then I said, they dropped me off and they gave me £0.50. And I looked at Daddy, you know, I said, I often heard Mammy and yourself speaking about WR, but I never heard you speaking about Mr. Bell. See, at the entrance gate there's a big thing, a big plaque says, Neury Union, and then signed by W.R. Bell. We always saw W.R. Bell. So I often heard you speaking about W.R., but I never heard you speaking about Mr. Bell. Oh, he said, I think, he said, we can speak openly in front of the children in the future, he says. So that was an incident. Another incident of my life in those early days, I went to school at the age of 3, just imagine. At the age of 3, when I was about 4 or 5, I was still in that school with the Sisters of Mercy, and Sister Celestine, she was the teacher. And I noticed that one of the boys came in one day with a pistol for shooting water, a water pistol. And I saw this, he was shooting water, and the sister confiscated the little thing and put it on top of the desk, you see, until we were going home. So he wasn't able, when we were going home, I stood back, I waited, watching the thing. And he went off, apparently having forgotten about the thing or thinking he wasn't going, she had confiscated it. So I came along and reached up and I took the pistol and hid it. I went home, and when I got home I went to the sink and filled it with water, and I began to shoot the water all around the kitchen. My father came in and he said to me, where did you get that? And then suddenly a touch of conscience crossed my mind. When I told him what had happened. He said, come on, he said, let's go back to the school. It was some distance, it would take about, say, half an hour to walk down to it. And I was just about to sit down to my dinner. I'd come in from school, about to sit down for dinner, and my father said, come, let's go back to the school and return this to Sister Celestine. But my mother said, let the child sit down first of all and have his dinner. He said, no, he must return the pistol first. So I had no dinner, and we walked back to the school. He asked for Sister Celestine, and he said to me, tell her what happened. So I had to tell her what happened, and I had to return the pistol. Oh, says she, Mr. Greenan, sure, I mean, children, you know, it'll be all right tomorrow. You didn't have to come back today. You could have told him to bring it back tomorrow. No, he said, he must be taught a lesson. He mustn't steal. So I came back and had a late dinner. So after that then, I didn't steal anymore. I'd learned the lesson. Now,
what about when the story of the orange?
Oh, the orange, yes. The orange story was, that's my babyhood still. My godmother was Mrs. McAteer, Dr. McAteer's mother, and she was to become the mother of Mary, who would marry my brother Kevin. Now, my mother had been a nurse, and Annie McGowan had been a nurse. She wasn't married yet. She wasn't married yet to John McAteer. So my mother and Annie McGrawan were great friends. And then when she married and had children, the McAteers, people came to regard the Greenans and the McAteers as being cousins. And then when they heard that Kevin was getting married to Mary, they said that can't be, they're first cousins. Well, there was no relationship whatsoever. So when I was born, my mother, well, she was very proud of me. Little Lawrence was the best mannered boy in the world. She believed that. So one day, Annie McGowan, who was my godmother, she came along with a little present for me, a little small orange, or perhaps it was a tangerine, or something I could take in my little hand. And I was there in my mother's arms, and Annie McGowan, my godmother, came in, and she handed me the orange. This was the test. This was going to be the test of my good manners, so I very solemnly took the orange. Both waited. Nothing happened. Then my mother began to shake me. She said, "Lawrence, Lawrence, what do you say? What do you say? Lawrence, what do you say?" So I very solemnly handed it back to my godmother, and I said, "Peel it." So from that on, I was always very practical. That was the story about it. Now, I didn't know that. That was never told me until the day that Kevin and Mary, Annie McGowan's eldest daughter, Mary, were getting married. And I was there. I was the one who performed the wedding ceremony. And at the reception afterwards, a big reception in the hotel. And Mary, the bride's mother, no, Annie McGowan, the bride's mother, Annie McAteer, my godmother, she was sitting on Kevin's right, on the right of the groom, and I was next to her, so she was sitting between the two of us. And I had to speak and all that, Kevin had to speak, but then Mary got up and she wanted to speak. And I thought that she was going to speak about Kevin, or what a wonderful fellow Kevin was. Or going
now, is Annie or...
This was my godmother, Annie.
You said Mary spoke.
Pardon?
You said Mary got up to speak.
No, Annie got up. Okay. Annie McAteer, Auntie Annie. We called her Auntie Annie. That's why they thought that we were cousins. So Auntie Annie gets up and she begins to talk. I thought she was going to speak about Kevin, to praise Kevin, a great husband that her daughter had got and all that. But instead of that, I was on her right, she began to speak about me. And she was my godmother. And then she told the story, which I had never heard before. And of course, everybody thought this was funny. It took the house down. But that's where I learned it, on the day of their wedding. Now, where do we go from there? Oh, yes. When I was, sometime about the same age, when I say, I would have been about, let us say, 10. There's a tram line, a tram running from Neury to Bessbrook. That's a distance of about 3 miles or so. And the tram station is there. So down the hill, we go down the bottom of the road. And from our window we could see the trams going up and down, passing up and down. An electric tram, but not like the trams in Italy or elsewhere, where the electric line is above and the thing goes up to touch the electric line. But in this case, the electric line was a third line between the other two. There was a middle line, and that was a line which carried the current. So I was over there one day coming home from school, and some older boys were there. And I saw these older boys. They would stand with a leg on either side of the middle line carrying the current, And I noticed they would jump up, well, land on the line, two legs simultaneously at the same time. And then they would go walking up the line, even when the tram was coming, so that we knew that the line was alive. They would go walking up, and then when the tram was coming, they would jump off 2 feet together. So I was talking to them, and I said, how can you do it? Oh, they said, you must put the 2 feet on together. If you put 1 foot on and the other foot off, you'll be killed instantly. So then I came along, a youngster, about 10, and I jumped my 2 feet on the line, and I began walking sedately up the middle line. The tram was coming towards me, I was laughing, and the man was ringing the bell, bang, 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 he was cursing and bang, bang, I was laughing at him, you see, walking towards the tram. I remember the light was on in the centre of the tram, and then when the tram was about, say, 20 yards from me, I jumped off to the side, and the man was cursing me as the tram went past. So I got up, turned round, my father was standing behind me, looking at me. So this was a different situation. So my father, you see, was there. He knew the danger. He said, this child knows something more than I know. He knows something more than I know, because he's not killed, he should be killed, he should be dead. Now, if I shout something, if I call him, he'll get frightened and he'll do something wrong, and he might be killed. So he seems to know what he's doing. So I just keep quiet and say nothing. The tram's coming, and we'll see what happens. I jumped off, and then he asked me, he said, where did you learn this? He said, from the other boys. And he said, why weren't you killed? Because, he said, you must have the 2 feet on together. If you have 1 foot on, 1 foot off, you'll be killed instantly. But when you get the 2 feet on together, then you're all right. And when you're getting off, you must jump off with the 2 feet together. I say, well, that's very fortunate, he said, I didn't call you, because I might have frightened you, and you might have done something wrong, you might have taken 1 step. He said, I'm glad I didn't call you. But he said, you're not to do that again. So my father went home, and he gave me a lecture. I wasn't to do it again. But then he said, this is a dangerous thing, because all these boys are doing this. My father was a public official, master of the workhouse, and was well known to the police, and is well known to the chief constable, head constable Henry. So he phoned head constable and told him what he had just seen and what was happening every day over there. So the head constable came over and gave orders that that part of the tram line from the station going out a certain distance up was all to be closed off by barbed wire so that people couldn't get in. So that was the story of the tram line. Let me see what time it is.
The time is now 2 minutes past 5 p.m.
2 minutes past 5.
What about, do you want to tell the story about the goose and the turkey? Do you like that story?
But not yet. I think we've covered a good deal today.
Oh, okay.
So,
You did, that was an hour.
an hour.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't think I'd been able to go